think he can hear us?" Cold, nervously rubbed frost from the viewplate on the crypt. "Fear not, Cold. Its metabolism is so greatly slowed that even if he could hear us, we would sound as incomprehensible as the buzzing of a gnat to him." The armor-glazed plate was already frosting over again, but Cold had caught a glimpse of the assassin within. His mask was off and his face frozen in a rictus of fury, teeth clamped together and his lips drawn back in a snarl. He was obviously young and would have almost looked comical but for the pure wells of hatred that were his eyes. Cold shuddered and turned away. Adeptus Scarlock hummed the Liturgy of Connection as he anointed one of the gargoyle-mouthed sockets on the side of the crypt with purified oils. Cold hurried over to him as he lifted the armoured cable which snaked across the floor. "There," Scarlock grunted, the word punctuated by the click of the cable going into the socket. A complex series of runes lit around the edge of the crypt, mostly green, a few amber, and 2 flickering uncertainly towards red. Scarlock frowned and administered a sharp ritual blow to the top of the crypt. The runes obediently steadied on green. He turned to Cold. "Now the Emperor is telling our EVERSOR friend here exactly what to do when he's dropped on the planet." "Praise be to the Emperor," Cold responded automatically, eyes still on the misting glass plate. "Aye, lad," Scarlock said. "And a poison curse on all the heretics." The Imperium of Mankind is well known for its emotionless and apathetic approach to the value of human lives. All across the galaxy it throws the sledgehammer of humanity forged of bone, flesh, sinew and souls, and while it is capable of wielding ancient and world-ending technology capable of shattering planets themselves, backed by near-immortal warriors of unfathomable skill, genetically engineered to be the supreme definition of elite forces, one of the Imperium's most unrelenting weapons is the loyalty and unbreakable will of its human forces, which it will throw down against its enemies with wanton abandon. Spewed forth by the thousands of hive worlds across the Imperium, which send wave after wave of their own men against the Xenos and heretics until their very engines are clogged with the dead. But it's not always the most sound strategy. Sometimes a surgical strike is required against a cell of heretics, a band of betrayers who are proving elusive or who needs to be shocked into submission. There may well of course be sometimes a suspected high-ranking Imperial official who is heavily protected on their world, and the discerning Inquisitor may choose not to spark a localized civil war by demanding their execution and pushing this through by force, although obviously that does happen. EVERSOR assassins are primarily used against rebels who have plans to move against the Imperium with a large armed force. When a long grinding war of attrition is ruled out, this is where you will see the sanctioned use of an EVERSOR assassin. Because, believe it or not, there are those within the Imperium who do actually understand that it may sometimes be beneficial to use a degree of restraint and precision to eliminate a problem before it reaches a stage where the only solution is a traumatic and protracted period of grinding system-wide warfare. For this purpose, among others, the Imperium wields its agency known as the Officio Assassinorum. The temples of Imperial assassins seek to not merely train acceptable human aspirants as elite killers. This is true for some of the assassin schools such as the Vindicare, but more often the assassins of the Imperium retain little of their humanity and are instead turned into quite literal monsters. They're crafted through a harrowing trial and turned eventually into weapons themselves. So dangerous in fact that they must be constrained when not in active service, and when unleashed will stop at absolutely nothing to complete their coded objectives programmed into their mind. For the few enemies of mankind who have encountered these nightmares made manifest and lived to tell of it, the impact of their deployment leaves an indelible scar spread throughout their social consciousness, and across the decades, the fear may become myth or legend due to the extreme brutality cut into their cultural flesh. Xenos or betrayers should always know that the Imperium will stop at nothing to purge them from its territories and eliminate them by any means necessary. The origins, though, of the EVERSOR Temple trace back to the age of the Great Crusade, when, as we learned previously, the first Master of Assassins formed the Officio Assassinorum alongside 6 individuals who had formed the Pact at Mount Vengeance in order to eliminate the Emperor's enemies from the shadows. Sire EVERSOR became the founder and first Director Primus of the EVERSOR, well known for its brutality. At the outbreak of the Horus Heresy, the Master of Assassins ordered an Officio Assassinorum execution force to be first assembled with the intention of eliminating the renegade Warmaster Horus. The EVERSOR assassins have a long history of wreaking havoc both within the Imperium and against its foes. When loyalists in M32 sought to hunt down Drakan Vangorich, and then Astartes of 3 chapters were then sent to execute him, upon their landing the strike force's commander was immediately assassinated, and the large force of Space Marines fought a battle against 100 assembled EVERSOR assassins. All the Astartes except one, Maximus Thane, were killed. Thane somehow managed to break into the traitor's hideout and terminate Vangorich. The EVERSOR were also deployed at the Taros campaign. After the discovery of a Tau headquarters, an assassin was sent to slaughter the Tau leadership on Taros as part of Operation Deathblow. As is nearly always used, a drop pod would deliver the EVERSOR to the surface of Taros, and after eliminating various Tau patrols and the fire warriors at the command center in order to then eliminate the Ethereal, which despite being heavily wounded, the EVERSOR was unrelenting and succeeded in killing the Tau leader as well as destroying their command center. It has been noted also that a large number of EVERSOR assassins took part in the more recent Indomitus Crusade of Ribot Guilliman, where they were used to sow terror ahead of the advance of conventional troops. Whilst a titanic war machine is a clear visual illustration of the Imperium's strength and may in its deployment alone be enough to turn the tides of war or assault upon a world the Imperium claims rights to, the assassin, and specifically the EVERSOR assassin, is the purest distillation of both the willpower and horror the Imperium will direct against its enemies. The hidden orders of the Assassinorum conceal masterpieces of destruction, some of which were devised by the Primarchs, Malcador the Sigillite, even the Emperor himself. The EVERSOR assassin is death incarnate. It will never stop, never hesitate, never question its directions. It exists for one purpose and one purpose only, to complete its objective at any cost. It will slaughter all in its path until it has destroyed its target, and only the foolish or the ignorant would dare to stand in its path. For the EVERSOR is a drug-fueled, psychotic killing machine. It will kill anything and everything it encounters. It's designed to tear apart the enemy in body and soul, and to leave them as a broken force shocked into submission by the ferocity and horror of the damage inflicted upon them by just a single human being. EVERSOR assassins are quite bluntly horrific in every way possible. Their physical appearance is something one might describe as body horror, not entirely dissimilar to that of a servitor, but arguably in fact far worse. Their actions, once they have eventually been modified, are, as I described, to serve as a precision strike tool, but one that is less a laser-targeted strike and more of a shredding tool that carves itself through the enemy like a human chainsword until it locates the final target and very often literally rips its heart out. EVERSORs, for many reasons, are one of the most terrifying and grotesque creations of the Imperium. I would place them up there with the Death Cult assassins for how offensive they are to the morality of humanity, for they are not simply converted as a servitor is. This comes later. Before they even reach this point, they first have to go through the trials, being whittled down to find the few who have the willpower and strength capable to serve. And if it were not clear, this is very obviously the Imperium's default approach when it comes to recruitment, that being some trial that if you fail, the consequences are at best a lifetime of servitude, a lesser fate might be death, and at worst you're looking at conversion to become a lobotomized servitor. Although for those of you who are the true worshippers of the Emperor, one might argue that continued servitude in any form is preferable to death within the Imperium. So recruitment into an elite force similarly to that of the Astartes or Grey Knights unsurprisingly tends to be quite savage, although, unlike the Marines, the process for assassins is far less refined, but equally if not more brutal. From the description so far, you might think that those who end up entering the process of becoming an assassin, and specifically the horror of the EVERSOR assassin, may be something more of a punishment. A delinquent, violent youth on a hive world, murderers, perhaps the children of a noble who is a traitor, and so on. All of these seem fitting for the general practices of the Imperium, except that recruits for assassins in actuality tend to originate from what are known as the Schola Progenium. These are basically academies, most usually run by the ecclesiarchy, and they are schools created to teach and train the orphans of imperial officials who have given their lives in the service of the emperor. Although it can also be that orphans are brought into a schola from the population of death worlds, feral societies, or hive cities. It also serves, of course, as a means by which these children are fully indoctrinated into the imperial cult from an early age and soon learn to regard the emperor as their spiritual father to a highly zealous degree. Life in the schola is extremely hard, a relentless grind of physical and mental challenge, taught to strive for both excellence and obedience in all things. The minds and bodies of the recruits are sharpened to a killing edge, whilst their spirit learns to embrace the emperor as master and immortal father. Graduates of the schola are known as progenitor, and because of their extreme loyalty and highly disciplined training, it's common to see them then selected for further specialised training and service within other imperial organisations which require the highest dedication to the Imperium. Progenitor often graduate to roles such as Tempestus Scions, Commissars of the Imperial Guard, Imperial Navy Officers, Adeptus Sororitas, Inquisitors, and then of course there come those who are selected to begin training as Imperial Assassins. While most of the youths trained within the schola will graduate to fairly standard roles within the Imperium, there are those who display certain creative flares who will be directed toward a different path. The skills they exhibit tend to be that of one thing and one thing only, and that is a penchant for the art of death. Once identified by those standing often within the shadows of a schola's selection day, they'll be led quickly away without any ceremonial pomp and circumstance, never to speak with or be seen by those who they have grown up with in the schola, and none of their meagre possessions will be taken with them. They will have no need for them where they're going, and that is to say, if they even ever survive the journey to their new school. Training will begin almost immediately. The well-trained but arguably highly sheltered youths will board the vast ships of the Officio Assassinorum for return to Terra, by which time upon arrival, if they do survive, they will have been directed toward a specific branch or temple of the assassins. The ships they will board are not the warm wooden beds of the schola, nor will they have the companionship of their friends and tutors built up with over the years. They'll now be thrown into a harrowing gauntlet of survival, cold, unforgiving, and unrelenting. Training is near enough continuous, and although obviously they will have to be allowed some time to sleep, this is often scant and comes at high personal risk. For when would you choose to catch an hour or two's sleep? Would your throat be cut as a punishment for dropping your guard for that brief moment? It's possible, and the choice is left to the individual. The recruits, the aspirants, will be pitted against a whole range of harsh environmental conditions within the corridors and training sectors of their ship. They'll be left little, if any, food and water, and so must be left to scavenge to survive, finding the meagre scraps that are left for them. Additionally, they'll have to endure breathing limited air for days at a time, navigate their way in 0G, or have this modified to an opposite crushing weight. They must endure unbearable heat, freezing cold, and while much of their apparent training is focused on learning to survive itself with extreme conditions, worse is, of course, to come. The recruits aboard the ships will be near enough from the moment they enter, tested on their combat skills. Which sounds reasonable enough, doesn't it? Except that the means by which they are tested are both cruel and horrific. For these recruits of the Assassinorum are not trained with instructors or set into dangerous assault courses for assessment. They're simply left within the ship to primarily fight amongst themselves. They must continually fight one another in a whole spectrum of armed and unarmed combat, all whilst enduring the conditions previously described, and these fights are very often to the death. There is little, if any, regulation by instructors, so recruits may kill each other over the slightest pretext, such as the last scraps of food and water that could be the difference between life and death. At other times, a number of recruits may be thrown into a section of a ship that is near enough total darkness, left to kill one another in a gruesome battle royale until only one remains. It's common that by the time the transport ships will arrive at Terra, only 10% of aspirants may remain, or even less, sometimes none at all. The assessing instructors for the recruits care little of how many will remain, only that those who do survive are suitable candidates for what is next to come as they progress into the true stages of their training. The surviving initiates will begin the next stage of their training within the shrouded and subterranean vast complexes below the surface of Terra. Their instructors will direct the few who survive into the various temples of the Officio Assassinorum, to which they will now belong until the day they die. There are several known temples, yet it's believed some exist which still remain completely secret. One of the most closely concealed but known temples is that of the Colexus, who utilize the absolutely terrifying Psyker assassins. Within a temple, the aspirants will continue learning their specific arts of death for a period of usually up to 10 years. Inevitably, their training becomes ever more demanding and rigorous over time as they're tested to beyond their personal breaking points. Their time will be spent fighting in deadly bouts, mastering their tolerance for pain, advanced tactical training, regular wrenching machines to push their physical selves to the absolute limit. Aspirants must additionally endure extended courses of psycho-indoctrination, hypnosis, and digest vast quantities of information about the Imperium which they are soon to be released upon. They must train with a vast array of weaponry and learn to become one with the highly specialized tools that their temple utilize. They will also begin to steel their bodies against the ravages of what will become a lifetime of aggressive steroid and stim usage. Of the assassins though, it is the EVERSOR who specializes in shock and terror tactics, who exists purely as a means for the Imperium to instill a profound fear of retribution into the hearts and minds of any who hold positions of power. An EVERSOR distills the brute force of an entire strike team into a single human body, and hence rarely has just a single target. Their missions most often primarily to crush the spirit of their foe, and simultaneously wreak physical havoc and destruction. The extreme level of brutality employed by the EVERSOR is by design, and its purpose is to ensure any would-be renegade leaders are destroyed while simultaneously ensuring that no successors may take over, or even consider doing so for that matter. The EVERSOR is a focused force designed to hit the enemy so hard that it can never get back up again. The EVERSOR is the pure definition of a superhuman killing machine. Their bodies are driven to the extreme zenith of human capability, often so aggressively is the push to maximize their killing potential that many recruits will die in the body modification process, their systems suffering critical multiple failures as they're overwhelmed by the chemical and physical balancing required to keep them functional at all. If successful though, and once the process is completed, the temple will finally instill the assassins with a final implant to twist the assassin's state of mind into a boiling cauldron of murderous intent, and to such an extreme degree that they will then usually be housed within a storage cryosleep device lest they turn on those around them in a murderous killing spree. For the successful recruits who had survived through the initial trials both on the ship and when they finally arrive at their selected temple, this is when they will begin their conversion into some of the most depraved and horrific weapons of war the Imperium wields. Yet few will suspect, or for that matter have any idea at all, about just what they must now face and endure. For these young individuals of the Imperial Schola who have endured so much already, it's likely better for their sanity that they're not aware of what will be expected of them. A recruit of any assassin temple at this point would have no say in what was still to come, but this is especially true for the recruits of the EVERSOR temple, who are almost unfortunately invariably chosen from the youngest of the available aspirants. The masters of the EVERSOR temple and the Medicus adepts are constantly developing and adapting a special program of genetics, bioimplants and chemical boosts to enhance their assassins. So, similarly to Astartes, the reasoning for this is because Imperial adepts require a body that has not been able to fully develop in order for it to be able to accept the many genetic alterations they're about to undergo. For the EVERSOR aspirants, this process is especially lengthy and arduous. It will begin with merely extensive testing, followed then by genetic manipulation and a steady program of drugs which will begin to alter their biochemistry. At first, results from specially designed training exercises will be heavily assessed to determine which specific alterations would be most suitable, and after these fairly tame first steps are taken, the real experiments will begin. The recruits will now be led to a specially designed surgical theatre where they will undergo near complete endoskeletal restructuring. Their body will be augmented and manipulated to increase physical stamina and aerobic performance, allowing them to fight for days without tiring at all. Muscular hypertrophy enables the assassin to explode into a fury of activity that lasts for hours at a time. But in order to cope with these changes, the EVERSOR will be grafted with a second heart. Not only does this give the assassin the extra survivability should one be damaged in combat, but it also ensures that when pushing a body to the limits, both organs can function to boost the extreme physical demand of a frantic killing frenzy. If the trainee's body survives the totality of these initial implants and modifications, then their cerebral cortex will also be enhanced by genetically coded microchips. These chips will amplify the assassin's state of mind, turning a mere dislike for the enemy into the purest raging hatred, or the wish to serve the Imperium with the most extreme determination and to complete their mission at any cost. This may be considered unnecessary, given how zealous the recruits already were, but it's worth remembering that the assassins of the EVERSOR are pushed to such an extreme level of chemical and physical strain that retaining their focus on just what it is they're meant to be doing also needs some boosting. And that's in order for them to remain basically functional at all. It's all about retaining a balance, and if they were simply to become drug-fueled psychopaths, they would be dangerous certainly, but not nearly as focused and useful, which is the entire purpose of an EVERSOR. They will see themselves modified also with additional adrenal and as well as electro elixirs being injected, speeding up the brain's higher functions and allowing the assassin to make complex calculations and tactical decisions in fractions of seconds. It may seem an obvious thing to say, but taking a young, albeit tough human and pushing them through a fairly extreme program of physical mental training followed by equally extreme body modification horror and chemical modification with the aim of turning them into a bio-enhanced rage-fueled killing machine does not come without risks. Many promising aspirants have simply died on the operating table or from some unforeseen side effect of their many complex modifications. Many of these side effects are actually known at this point to the medicus adepts and can be countered by glandular implants that constantly feed the necessary counteractive agents into the assassin. However, every EVERSOR assassin's body is in a state of constant agitation and conflict. The chemicals and quantity of them used are highly dangerous not just for the assassins themselves, but for those around them. For while a living EVERSOR's body can keep everything in a relative state of control and balance using what's described as their hypoimmunosystem and their advanced cortex, these maintain safe combinations of chemicals within their body. But should an assassin's heart stop or their brain fail, these dangerous chemical concoctions in the body will begin to react at an ever-accelerating rate. As a dying assassin's control over their body drops, they will quickly reach a point of criticality whereby they will first spontaneously combust and then in a fraction of a second set off a chain chemical reaction with such explosive force that their bio-meltdown will very likely kill all of those standing nearby. The EVERSOR assassins themselves actually consider this to be a beneficial thing, for they exist purely to complete their objectives by any means necessary, and often this means death. For they are death incarnate, and so even in death they continue to blindly slaughter and destroy. They live to relish every life they can extinguish in the name of the glorious Emperor of Man. Once an EVERSOR has reached a state whereby they may actually be deployed, they're faced with several additional problems. The first and most obvious is that an EVERSOR will now be so hyped up on drugs, rage and ranging levels of psychosis that they may become extremely dangerous even to their allies around them. And this is not entirely dissimilar to the punishment inflicted upon the heretics of conversion to become an archoflagellant, where they are fitted with control devices to help prevent them from killing anyone and anything within their reach. The EVERSOR Temple finds itself in a similar predicament. And there are also other problems for the EVERSOR, in that their bodies have been pushed so hard and to such an extreme that their lifespans are considerably shortened. The light which burns twice as bright burns half as long, and so forth. Lastly, on top of this, the extremely potent cocktail of stims, chems and drugs pumping through their system are not only dangerous but also insanely addicting. For all their strength, the EVERSOR are in some respects actually quite weakened by the ordeal of body conversion, and they're left completely reliant on the saturation of drugs in their body. If they were to be unable to receive regular infusions, they would enter into a very fast downward spiral of withdrawal, and their body would then crash and die. To deal with these demanding needs for the EVERSOR, unlike most other assassins or indeed operators for the Imperium, EVERSORs are by design much more like a tool than a conscious walking member of an Imperial service. To that end, the EVERSOR, once completing its final stages of conversion and training, will be placed into a cryostasis chamber, either at their temple or location they're required. More often though, they'll be placed aboard Assassinorum stealth ships and tactically critical space stations throughout the Imperium. Not that it's really especially relevant, but for an EVERSOR they will have little sense as to how much time passes in the galaxy. since he or she were last awakened to carry out a mission. It could have been decades, centuries, or longer. It's largely irrelevant though, because for an assassin existing in a near permanent state of cryosleep, only moments will have passed since their last completed assignment, and they will then emerge in a continuing and permanently heightened rage focused absolutely upon carrying out their next objective. Only the highest level of clearances will enable the activation of an EVERSOR assassin, and formerly this was the High Lords of Terror, now it fall to the Lord Commander of the Imperium, or indeed also the Overwatch of the Ordo Sicarius, who are meant only to oversee, but that is highly questionable. Once activated, an EVERSOR assassin will be transferred from their cryogenic pod into a special one-person drop pod. The assassin will all the while continue to remain in stasis, and as we learned during the opening, this is where a cybernetic neural link will be connected and feed all relevant mission details directly into the assassin's neural cortex. As the ship approaches the drop zone, an automated system will begin to rouse the assassin out of its sleep and prepare their body with the necessary infused cocktail of combat drugs that best fits this specific mission profile. As the pod impacts the surface and its heavily secured door bursts open, the EVERSOR assassin has fully awoken and is now fully equipped to carry out their operation. The slaughter of any and all they encounter will be the only means by which an EVERSOR can satiate their raging psychotic bloodlust. For many EVERSOR, by the time they've reached a point of active service, they will have little if any memory remaining of their early lifetime, nor the means by which to understand how they reached the point they now find themselves at. But the ever-increasing level of brutality and murder they have been encouraged to carry out throughout their lifetime has left them as truly mentally broken. They will exist at this point now as hollow machines of murder. They're quite literally addicted to killing, will not hesitate to kill anyone or anything up until the point their mission is successfully completed and they're able to be secured by the EVERSOR temple. Incidentally, the means by which this occurs is less clear. It's possible a recall procedure is encoded into their cerebral cortex, or perhaps some means of a temporary inhibitor drug is activated to render them temporarily pacified for a short window, enabling them to be secured back into cryostasis. But these are my speculations. Like many things in the Imperium, details are sparse. These cryostasis storage systems of the EVERSOR are one of the most important tools in terms of their general operation. It prevents them from burning out in a matter of years, or for that matter having to be contained in some cell or other situation that is highly dangerous to techs, not to mention preventing them from being destroyed because they simply became too unstable or worrying about some malfunction that might cause themselves as living chemical bombs to just explode. And this need for cryosleep was identified early on. The original location for EVERSORs to be stored upon Terra back in the earliest days was that of the northern polar region of Terra, deep beneath glacial ice. And this is when it would have been decided how it was best for them to be kept in their frozen dormant state, where they would be retained in conduits filled with super chilled methylene gas. All of the EVERSOR facilities and their cryosleep systems are maintained by specific techs who deal purely with these systems. When it comes to weapons though, EVERSORs do not use a heavy long-range rifle, as they're usually operating in close-quarter situations. They primarily use what is titled the Executor or Executioner pistol. This is a terrifying hybrid of a needle and bolt pistol. Its two modes enable it to fire either a hypertoxin dart or bolt mass reactive shells. Often an assassin will use these in combination, rather than exclusively, to ensure death by both frying and dissolving out the nerves within the body of their enemy by means of the neurotoxins, coupled with the explosive force of a bolt round bursting their body open even as their nervous system is frying. Executioner victims are inevitably left in a sorry, contorted mess, both effective and horrifying for any would-be renegades. In addition to their already highly elevated senses, the EVERSOR also use a tool known as a Sentinel Array. This contains an entire system of motion tracking and target acquisition tools which enable them to sense enemy movements from all directions continually and as instinctively as if they were their own natural senses. This enables an EVERSOR to be aware of targets they have not made visual contact with, enabling them then to fire upon enemies the moment they're sighted. The EVERSOR will also process all of this information via their cerebral augments at such high speed that when their body is performing at maximum efficiency, they can engage enemies at a dizzying speed. And where an ordinary Imperial soldier would become quickly overwhelmed, an EVERSOR can easily handle and engage multiple enemies in a 360-degree range at all times. The EVERSOR are well known for their massive infusion of chemicals they use to become one of the most feared Imperial operatives, but they're also able to actively inject themselves with additional drugs while deployed to further enhance their abilities dependent on whatever situation they're facing. Some will just vastly increase the assassin's speed, others will turn the EVERSOR into even more of a berserker whirlwind than they were already, moving around like more of a warp entity as they become a whipping blur of evisceration. Finally, the EVERSOR may deliberately infuse itself with a cocktail designed to self-destruct. The EVERSOR will always aim to complete its objective and may choose to set itself on a chemical ticking timer as it charges into the enemy, who will not be expecting their foe to randomly explode in their faces as a final act of defiance. The assassin also carries several close-quarter weapons as well, as this is their typical operational environment, being sent deep into hive cities or enemy bunkers to infiltrate and mercilessly execute all within. Their two weapons are the Neurogauntlet and a shortened custom Imperial Power Sword. The Neurogauntlet is good for both viscerally shredding flesh, but it also ensures that an EVERSOR assassin's very touch is death. When the needled fingers of an operative's exoskeletal glove are plunged into the enemy's flesh, it delivers a massive dose of neurotoxins that kills the victim truly horrifically in a matter of seconds, overloading and melting down their nervous system. The only downside here is that although this is very effective against mortal creatures, the toxins will have little if any effect on warp entities such as demons, and it's questionable how effective it would be against enemies such as the Tyranids. As noted, the EVERSOR also uses a custom power sword, and while these are used widely throughout the Imperium, you would hardly call them common, as they still represent highly advanced technology. In fact, they likely originate from the Dark Age of technology, although they have been present since the very inception of the Imperium. A power sword functions by projecting a disruptive energy field along the blade edge of the weapon, allowing it to slice through near enough any armor or strike against it with an explosive impact. In theory, any weapon can be upgraded to a power weapon given the necessary technology, but it is mainly used by the Astartes given their need of engaging against some of the most heavily armored and deadly creatures in the galaxy. So for an EVERSOR, who will most likely often be engaging human threats within the Imperium itself, the use of a power sword coupled with their fighting skills and drug-fueled pace gifts them a tool which will quite literally shred through the enemy. An EVERSOR dropping from above into the midst of an entire squad of renegade guardsmen, for example, would see them diced into quivering, bloody flesh cubes in a matter of seconds. Nothing would protect them from the blade as it passes through them without any resistance whatsoever. The molecular dissonance would tear these victims apart at an atomic level. As I noted, these blades are additionally somewhat shorter than say an Astartes or a Commissar's power sword, as they will be fashioned for an individual EVERSOR. The weapon's super dense core also weighs considerably more than any comparable sword, but thanks to the EVERSOR's stim-enhanced strength, it allows every sweep to cut their enemies to shreds without any encumbrance whatsoever. Lastly, EVERSOR assassins will usually, although not always, carry melter bombs with them should they need to carry out any destruction of infrastructure or, for example, disable a means of escape for their foe, say an Arvus transport. As per all melter-designed weapons, these bombs explode with intense thermal energy. Their focus is on overcoming heavily armoured targets, and so they're often especially useful for attacking vehicles, buildings, and other armoured targets. Some specific designs will also enable them to be attached to walls, hulls, or bulkheads and set for a timed detonation. An EVERSOR assassin is a true one-man army. It is capable of overcoming significant odds and numbers of enemies that would mean categoric failure for ordinary human operatives. Their array of weaponry means they're more than handily equipped to best execute their objectives, which is most commonly the outright unrelenting slaughter of the enemies of the Imperium. They will achieve their goals by any means necessary, eviscerating their foes, slashing them to pieces, firing fast bursts of toxin needles, leaving behind them a wake of screaming, thrashing horror upon the ground as their enemies barely have a chance to understand what has happened to them. In close quarters, they excel, cutting through armour with power blade sweeps, stabbing enemies through the chest, or engaging with their bolt pistol at point-blank range. If all this were to fail, throat-crushing punches, or just using crudely whatever else is to hand. The EVERSOR assassin is one of the most brutal, unrelenting, and ruthless killing machines created out of the darkness that is the Imperium of mankind. So efficient and dizzying the speed and ferocity that is launched down upon the enemy, their foes are barely given a chance to become even aware that they're under attack. That is, until the doors of their secure location are literally torn down or their comrades are falling to the floor around them in agony. Most often, they may not even have the time to react themselves before they're falling to the floor, cleanly cut in two. The EVERSOR exists in the shadows, but it excels in the brutal ferocity of plain sight. Its greatest weapon is the fear and horror it unleashes upon the enemies of man, and most importantly of all, it stands as a clear reminder to those who would dare to question the authority of the Imperium or to rebel against it. From the highest of Imperial governors to the cult or renegade cell lurking in the darkness of a hive city, consider your actions carefully, or you may find yourself facing a cybernetic machine of war, a creature born of pain and suffering and endless slaughter from their earliest days, who lives in a never-ending permanent cycle of psychotic rage and murder until the day they perish and their body is consumed in a devastating bio-meltdown. Fear is one of the Imperium's greatest weapons, and its most effective tool to enact this is the EVERSOR assassin. Artyom was awakened. His instant response was a wordless scream of anger and rage. He did not need to grasp the concept behind retaliation, for he was retaliation's given form. Immediately, Artyom pushed down hard against the restraints that bound him in his small chamber. His metabolism had sped into overdrive as soon as he had been awakened from his cryogenic sleep, and a shockwave of violence was sweeping through his mind. Behind his crimson skull mask, Artyom's teeth were bared and froth was bubbling from his lips. This was his eternal resting state. He was conditioned to be hateful, the wrath of the Emperor himself in human form, and yet his anger was nothing compared to the pure madness that would unfold once the Frenzon was unleashed into his metabolism. Not yet, though. They needed his attention for a few more moments. While Artyom struggled in his restraints, several small servo cranes descended from the ceiling like skeletal fingers, closing in on his head. A needle sat on the end of each of the devices, and they plugged into small jacks in Artyom's skull mask. They penetrated the skin and the cranium beneath it to bore right into his brain, injecting sounds, images, smells, and other impressions. Artyom was like a bestial hound, and now he had a scent to follow. He gritted his teeth and growled before rattling at his restraints once more. With a soft, wet noise, the needles withdrew from his head and disappeared into the shadows above. A red warning lumen lit up the small chamber where the EVERSOR assassin was held in place, and a piercing alarm sounded. With a sudden lurch, the drop pod was released, descending to the planet beneath, like a comet of doom.